Welcome back to another episode of Fearless Society podcast. We are looking forward to today's episode and we're excited that you're joining us. Today, we are talking all about rest. So let's get into it.
You're listening to the Fearless Society podcast. We're building a community of fearless Christians who boldly live out the call that God has placed on our lives, who aren't afraid to talk about who we are and what we believe. Following Jesus today isn't easy, but it is worth it. Our goal is to come alongside you as we encourage and equip each other to live boldly and fearlessly, because a fearless church begins with us. Together, we are the Fearless Society.
All right. Yeah, like I said before, we are getting into the topic of rest. We are still talking about spiritual disciplines. But before we get started, I wanted to just talk about our vacation that we had last year. Like, how many of us...
It was a vacation.
It was not a vacation. How many times when you're talking about or thinking about the craziness and the chaos and the busyness of life, and you go, man, I need a break. I need some rest. I need a vacation. Right?
Yeah.
And we were kind of going through a season like that. We
needed a vacation.
It was awful. It was a really rough season. So then we were like, oh man, we need a vacation. And my mom was like, hey, I'm going to Maine. Here are the dates. You should totally come. Bring all your kids. For those listeners who don't know, we have 5 kids. Last year they were 7 and under. This year they're, a year older. So we were like, oh, this is great. We'll get away. We'll go on vacation. We'll take our 5 kids and we'll get together with my mom. At least it's not like just the 2 of us and 5 kids. We'll have hands. Yeah, it was
wild. It was a really good time. We had a lot of fun together. Yeah. It's a really good time as a family, but it was not relaxing or restful at all. It was very busy. And even the moments that we didn't have something planned to be going on. With 5 kids, there was always somebody asking for something or needing something.
Somebody needs sunscreen. Somebody wants to go on a boat ride. Somebody wants to,
Yeah, somebody else wants to go fishing. Everybody wants to do something different. And so we had a lot of fun, but it was not restful.
And it was so funny because I was like, man, like I need a staycation after this vacation, just so I can rest and like recover from the busyness of this 1-week vacation in Maine. And we ended up getting that through some other means, but yeah.
Yeah, we
ended up getting sick, and then I got sick.
Yeah, we caught COVID on vacation, and so then we came home and had to quarantine for a few days. So
that's the Lord blessing us with more rest. So life gets crazy, and sometimes in the midst of the crazy, we start to really need some rest. And so I thought it'd be fun, Nick, if you could go anywhere in the world on vacation, where would you go?
Oh my gosh, anywhere in the world. I grew up in New York State, and I've traveled, quite a few different places, especially around the East Coast. But a couple places out west and South and Central America, and lots of wonderful, beautiful places. But there's just something about New York State, and I'm not a fan at all of our politics here, but it's just a beautiful state geographically. Lots of good people here too, and so probably somewhere in like the Adirondacks or the Catskills would be. I like the mountains. And I like being out in nature. So somewhere in one of those mountain ranges in my home state of New York would be, that'd be where I'd be.
Yeah, I'm like so torn. I'm like, I would be home. Just good old pair of sweatpants at home, doing nothing. But then I've also always wanted to go to Ireland because it just sounds beautiful. And the pictures that I've seen from there just sound great. So let's just get into the spiritual discipline of rest. So to start off, I figured we could talk about God's example of rest. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this comes right from the beginning of Scripture in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 says, "And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done. And he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And so right from the beginning, God created the heavens, God created the earth, God created all the things on the earth, and then God stopped to take a rest. And I think this has always been really profound to me, because God didn't need to rest.
Right.
I mean, God is all powerful. He didn't have a need. It wasn't like he was tired from creating the world, but he chose, after doing what he had done, to take time to rest.
Right. And so he sets an example for us in that, like, God, though he has all of the power and the capability to keep going, he stopped and rested. And I think sometimes we get in these modes where it's like, okay, we just got to keep going. We got to keep going and keep going. And I'm not feeling tired. I have the power to do this. I have the ability. And so why don't I just keep going? And we don't realize that it's actually detrimental for us in the long term, but God set this example for us. I think one of the things that I've struggled with when it comes to practicing the spiritual discipline of rest is this idea of looking at God's example and going, okay, God worked this full week, and then on the seventh day he rests. He finished his work, then he rested. And so oftentimes I look at rest as a reward. Like, if I've done enough during the week, if I've completed my to-do list, well, then I get to sit and I get to relax. Otherwise, I got to keep going. I got to make sure that things are done. Or I can't go to bed at night until I finished all of these different things. And on one hand, it's like, okay, like, I'm making sure that the things that I have been called to do, the things that I need to get done are done. But also, like, that's not what rest is. Like, rest is not just a reward for a job well done or when you check enough things off of your to-do list. It's a spiritual discipline. It's a habit that we form that allows us to complete the things on our to-do list.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that rest is not just something that we reward ourselves with after we've gotten everything done. Yeah, I think another thing, kind of while we're on what rest isn't, is I think that rest is not just a lack of busyness, right? You can practice the spiritual discipline of rest even through busy seasons of your life. And in fact, I think that's when it's most important to practice it. And you can also have seasons of your life where you're not very busy and not actually be taking the time to rest. I think, and another way that this can play itself out is, there are people who have gone so hard and pushed themselves so hard that they get totally burnt out. Some people to the point of physically collapsing and being unable to keep going physically. But if you get back up and get right back into things as soon as you're physically able, you haven't actually rested. You may have recovered a little bit, but you haven't actually taken the time to rest.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think of our lives, like, right now, we're kind of in a busy season. I mean, we're kind of transitioning with jobs, and there's just so much going on in this season of life. And yet we're trying to be very intentional about taking time and saying, okay, you know what? This can get done later. I'm going to pause this because God called me to rest. And if I don't rest, I'm not going to be able to keep going. And I have been in seasons in my life where I'm burnt out, I'm exhausted, and I'm sick because I've been going so much. And I view that sickness as rest. I mean, just going back to our story about, like, oh, our vacation was so busy. And then I joked about how, like, we were on vacation, and I joked and I was like, oh, well, can I just tell everybody that we were on vacation, so we're going to, like, quarantine for a week just so we can have some rest. And then my mom called me when we got back and was like, yeah, I have COVID. You guys should test just in case. And, it wasn't really bad. Like, we didn't feel really sick for very long, but it was almost like this relief, like, oh, okay, we're sick. We finally get to rest. And that's a sign that you're not practicing the spiritual discipline of rest. If
Yeah.
you're looking at sickness as you're waiting to get sick so that you can rest, you're not practicing the spiritual discipline of rest, or you have an unhealthy view of rest.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And so on the flip side of that, like, rest is holy. Like God chose to rest. He chose to set aside the Sabbath day, the seventh day of the week, and make it holy. Rest is not a bad thing. It's not just something you need as you get older, or you need when you're really young, or you need when you're not feeling good. Rest is a holy moment where we're taking time to set aside whatever amount of time that we have. It could be a day, could be a week, could be a couple hours, and just resetting ourselves to remember our humanity and our needs before a powerful God.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it's a recognition, kind of like tithing is a recognition of putting trust in God for my finances, because God is the provider of all. And so I give back to him in recognition of that. Rest is kind of a recognition that God is the provider of my time. And so I give back a portion of my time to rest, as God set the example of acknowledging him as the giver of my time. And that if I'm going to be successful in all of the things that I need to accomplish, whether those things look anything like earthly success or not, but if I'm going to achieve those things that I'm setting out to achieve, if I don't recognize God as the provider of the time that I need to achieve those things, I'm going to have a hard time.
Right. And I think it's not just even time. Like, this is getting us into our next point. Like, the spiritual discipline of rest shows us that we are not God. It reminds us that we're not God. We think we have to accomplish it all, and yet God is the one at work accomplishing things in us and through us. Yes, you have life things. Your dinner's not going to make itself. Your laundry's not going to clean itself. Manna, last I checked, manna is not falling from heaven, just being provided on a regular basis for us, So there is an aspect of, there are things in your life that need to get done. And yet we kind of feel like we have to shoulder the burden for everything. Like, everything rests on our shoulders. Whether or not our kids grow up and are successful, oh man, the burden's all ours. No, like, the burden is God's, and he invites us to join with him in the work. But God is often the one accomplishing things through us, despite our own limitations. And so rest reminds us that we're not God, that we don't have to be.
Yeah. I think that's especially true too. I'm forgetting the reference, but it's especially true in terms of our salvation, right? That we, and the Bible talks about the Israelites, when they disobeyed God, they were unable to enter into God's rest. And that through the blood of Jesus, we can once again enter into the rest of God.
Sounds like something in like Romans or Hebrews.
Yeah, I'm totally blanking on the reference, but it's go find it. Let me know in the comments where it is.
Yeah. And I think, we talked kind of about this in the first couple episodes in season 1, because we wanted to set a foundation of the fact that we are not God and we don't have to be, and how freeing it is to allow God to be God. We had an episode on how God is all powerful, and we had an episode on how God is all present and all knowing. And so definitely go back and rewatch those episodes. They're available. But, just in the idea of like God being all powerful, all present, and all knowing, like, how often do we go through life and go, oh, I'm all powerful, I can do all of this stuff. And yet at the end of the day, we're burnt out and exhausted and find we don't have the strength to keep going. How often do we go, oh, I'm all knowing? Like, I think of our kids, like, they ask us the craziest questions. Like, last summer in Maine, it was like, what do lobsters eat? Or do you know what this does, or what that's for? What makes broccoli green? Just random questions. They just want to know so much about the entire world all at once. And they expect us to have the answers, that it's so tempting to think that, like, well, I'm all knowing. I can look up anything I want on my phone. It's right there at my fingertips. But I'm not all knowing. Like, Google's great. Google's all knowing, like,
well, that's debatable.
But it's like, we think that we're all knowing because we don't have to search for those answers. And yet we're not really all knowing. Or like, I mean, how many of us have done this? Like we're sitting on a Sunday morning watching church online on our phones at the same time in our pajamas. So we're like, okay, we're on our phones. Maybe we're having a conversation with a friend, or we're on Facebook looking at somebody's pictures, feeling like we're there. We're also at the same time watching church service. It's supposed to be like, oh yeah, I'm at church, but you're also at your home. So you're like, I'm in 3 places at once. Or like where we used to live was like right in the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. There's like a rock that has the like lines on each of them. And it's like, oh, you can go stand in 3 places at once, but you can't actually be in all 3 places at once. And like science has actually shown, like they've done studies. And if you, when you multitask, you're less likely to remember the things that you're supposed to remember. So like if you're on your phone at the same time as you're watching online church, like you're less likely to be engaged in one of those. And so you're missing out on what's going on. And so it's like, oh, I can be at 2 places at once, except you're not fully present in either of those places. Like only God is all present. And how amazing it is that we don't have to be that way. We don't have to be in more than one place at once. We don't have to be all knowing. We don't have to be all powerful, because God is. And I'm not God.
Yeah, absolutely.
So like once I came to the realization that I'm not God, and that I didn't have to be him, and I didn't have to be like I didn't have to become who he is. Like I don't have to be God. Man, it made my life so much more restful. There was so much more peace, because I wasn't striving anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what are some things that some misconceptions about rest, maybe especially related to because rest and Sabbath are also often very connected. And so what are some maybe misconceptions that we can easily have relating to those things?
Like about Sabbath and rest? Well, I think it's funny, like growing up in church, we all memorize the 10 commandments, right? Like, and it's like, oh, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. And what most often is portrayed is like, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. So every 7 days you should be in church. Like you should set aside a day and you're just supposed to come to church, and then you go home and you don't do anything, and while like there's an aspect of that in Judaism, like they still practice the Sabbath, like they do not do work. They prepare things the night before, they get ready for the Sabbath because they know they're not going to do any work. I might make some people angry with this, but Gentile believers, us today as Protestant evangelicals, we are not under the law that requires a Sabbath, and yet Sabbath is still a God-instituted, God-ordained thing.
Yeah.
And so,
well, Jesus kind of principalized it in the New Testament, right? When he said that, man was not created for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man.
Right.
Right. And so God didn't have this Sabbath rule and then create human beings to follow this rule. He created human beings, and then he said, here's what human beings need. Human beings need rest. I'm going to set the example of rest, and I'm going to tell them that this is what they should be doing. They should be resting and taking time and setting it aside to rest. And so Jesus took the law, the commandment, and made it a principle of rest.
Yeah. And so oftentimes, though, we view it as this law that we have to keep. I even heard a pastor one time equate the Sabbath with the Sunday morning church gathering. And he was like, well, as long as you come to church on Sunday, or if you can't make it Sunday, like some other night of the week, then you're fulfilling the Sabbath. And so the 1 hour church service was the fulfillment of Sabbath. And I think for some people it can be. If you're in ministry,
probably need more than an hour, but
probably should have more than an hour. But I mean, if you're in ministry, especially, or if you're volunteering at your church, or you're, even if you're just watching kids in the nursery, like that's hard, man. Those nursery workers, they like, if you're a nursery worker, or if you're a children's ministry leader of any sort, listening to this, like, God bless you. Like, that is not easy. But anyways, the church service isn't Sabbath. It may be part of Sabbath, but rest is setting aside time to remember that you're not God and to consider your human weaknesses and be okay with that, you know? So the Sunday morning church service is not the same thing as Sabbath. But we do tend to look at this like legalistically, especially in regards to the church service. I don't know. Is there anything else you can think of?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think maybe just this is maybe a little bit different, maybe going back a little further into a different topic, but rest is not laziness, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very intentional thing. So you don't want to be lazy and use the excuse that you're just resting, right? Oh, I'm just resting. I'm just taking a Sabbath. Rest is not an excuse to be lazy. God's given us work to do, and He wants us to do that, and our obedience to Him should require us to do that. But part of that is being intentional about taking times to rest. And I think this is especially important when there's things to do, right? It's easy to rest when you've completed everything and there's nothing left on your to-do list. It's hard to be disciplined enough to take rest when you feel like there's still a lot of things that need to be done, especially for me when other people are counting on the things that I have to get done. When other people are waiting on the things that I need to get done, it can be very difficult for me to be disciplined to take rest in those times. And that discipline really oftentimes has to start sometimes days in advance of saying, there's things that people are counting on me for that need to get done. And so I need to make these things a priority, even though they may not be the most important things on my list, but because other people are counting on me for those things, they get moved up a little bit higher. And I try and take care of those things first so that when the time that I've set aside to rest comes around, I don't have that pressure trying to keep me from being disciplined and resting.
Right. So it's kind of like time management allows you to practice the spiritual discipline of rest.
Yeah.
I think just something we do, and, you could argue that this isn't really the spiritual discipline of rest. And, we still need to take a little bit more rest in this, but we are in a very busy season of life. You're a pastor. We are at church early and we're one of the last people to leave the church. Like Sundays are really busy for us. But because I know that Sundays can be very busy and kind of chaotic. I mean, the devil loves to like hide shoes on Sunday morning. That like we've planned for that. And so our breakfast for our family on Sunday morning, like we do bagels every Sunday morning because we know that it doesn't take long. It's something the kids can independently start breakfast by themselves. They know how to, they know what they need. It's a safe, easy breakfast for them to do themselves. And it's something we can take in the car with us if we're running late. And so we've built a restful routine into our Sunday mornings so that we're not rushing around trying to cook breakfast, make breakfast, and get everything ready to get all of our entire family out the door on time. And so sometimes practicing the spiritual discipline of rest isn't always setting aside an entire Sabbath day. It's looking at your day, looking at your life and saying, okay, how can I practice rest within what God has given to me? I know my limitations. I am not going to be making a big Sunday morning breakfast. My kids know that Sunday morning comes around and it's bagels. They tell me, oh, we should try these bagels this week or those bagels next week or something like that. They get excited about it. But it's simple and it means that I can, when I'm leaving the door to get to church, I'm not stressed out and flustered. So now I can take my energy from that morning and I can focus it on God and I can go, okay, what does God have for us in church this morning? And I can begin to pray for the church service, even on our way to church, because I'm not stressed out and flustered because I've been running around all morning.
Yeah. And right now with our schedules, it's basically impossible to have a full Sabbath day each week. Right. And so we've kind of built our schedules around a couple of partial Sabbath days throughout the week.
Yeah. And you have to be intentional. And it's not you can't just wait for a Sabbath day to pop up.
Right.
I think we were looking at our calendar and we're like, yeah, it's not till November that we have a full Saturday with nothing going on. And so we marked that day off and we're like, this is going to be a family day and we're going to take the full day and we're just going to spend time together as a family. But in the busyness, it's about looking at your calendar, looking at your schedule, looking at your day, looking at your life and saying, how can I intentionally slow down and take the focus off of my to-do list, off of the task at hand and put it back in Christ?
The beauty of this is that this is a God-ordained principle of nature, to the point that there are secular companies that block out their employees from accessing any of their email accounts, any of their work devices, things like that, on one day a week. It's not a real common practice, but there are companies that do that because they've done studies and found that when you take a day off, you're actually more productive over the course of the 7-day week when you have one of those days that you don't work. And so in 6 days of working and 1 day of rest, you can actually accomplish more than in 7 days of working, which is just, it's mind-boggling, but it seems to be the truth of the world. And there may be some exceptions to that here and there, but the general principle that God laid out is true to the point that unbelievers recognize it.
Yeah. So if we look a little bit more into the Sabbath idea, Sabbath started in Genesis when God rested from his work of creation. He made creation on the seventh day. He set it aside as a day of rest. Then in Exodus, after the Israelites leave Egypt, God institutes a Sabbath and tells the Israelites that the seventh day would be a day of rest for everyone. And it wasn't just this thing that just the Israelites did. No, God said, let me just read. Exodus 23, verse 12 says, 6 days shall you do work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and that the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. And so this is this principle that isn't just supposed to be for God's people, but he's actually God's actually instituting the Sabbath, and he's saying, okay, your animals rest, your servants rest, your visitors, any foreigners that are in your community, they don't have to do work either. Everyone, regardless of their heritage, regardless of man, woman, infant, child, animal, everyone deserves rest. And then this rest isn't just about doing anything or doing nothing all day. Later in Deuteronomy, again, God's still giving the law to Israel. He says, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And so the reason God commanded in the law Israel to keep the Sabbath day was a day and a time to remember that God worked their salvation for them, that God moved in power when they couldn't have, that God freed them from slavery and bondage when they couldn't free themselves. And so this is where we get the idea that the Sunday church service is Sabbath, because we're remembering what God has done for us. And yet anytime you have rest and you have intentional spiritual discipline, habit, practice of rest, remember intentionally, okay, I am resting because I am human and I cannot do what God does. God saved me, I can't save myself. God called me, I can't call myself. And so it's this intentional shifting your focus off of you and putting it on Christ and his salvation and his power.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a beautiful passage in the Psalms that I think you wanted to talk a little bit about. You want to get into that now?
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll try to be fast. This, again, we touched on this whole Psalm in the first season. It's Psalm 46. It's my favorite verse of all time. It's where God says, be still and know that I am God. and it's Psalm 46:10. And so sometimes to increase rest, we simply need to stop. So the phrase be still is the Hebrew word rapha, and it means to cease, to put an end to let alone, let go, to be faint, to sink, or to relax. And so when I read this verse, I just picture God just being like, just stop. It's okay. And he's telling Israel to just stop pushing forward on their own. He wants them to stop stressing about every little tiny thing. And he's telling them to just let it go and relax. He's encouraging Israel to recognize their weakness. To be still and know that he is God is to recognize our weakness and be okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just think of, there's several places in the New Testament where it talks about God kind of in relationship to harvest or growth, and just how, people are involved in the work of God. God invites us as people into his work, but it's always God who is the source of power behind what's happening, right? Mm-hmm. We might plant, we might water, but God brings the harvest. God brings the increase. Right. And so it doesn't matter, God's going to bring that increase. God's going to bring the harvest, and he invites us in to be a part of that. But our striving harder is not going to make anything better than what God's already doing.
Right. Yeah. And I think sometimes we put our self-worth in what we do. And, being able to practice the spiritual discipline of rest is being able to know that your worth doesn't come from what you do. Your worth doesn't come from how many things you can accomplish in a day or how well you do at XYZ. Your worth comes from your creator who created the world and said it's good, put mankind in it, made them in his own image, said it is good, and calls us to work from a place of rest, recognizing that our weakness is not a bad thing. Our weakness actually just points to Christ. Our weakness points to a God who is all powerful, who is all knowing, and who is all present. And we don't have to be. And so when we practice the spiritual discipline of rest, we are practicing a constant reminder of the gospel and the salvation of Christ. And it's only through the gospel, it's only through salvation that we can even find rest to begin with. And so as we practice the spiritual discipline of rest, we remind ourselves of the gospel and we live a gospel-focused life that is pleasing and glorifying to our Savior.
Amen to that. Well, go take a nap and we'll see you next week. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments or send them to us. We'd love to hear from you.